I visited my father without warning. When I arrived, he froze at the door, grabbed my arm, and pulled me inside. "Come in quickly, hide right now." I barely had time to ask anything. He shoved me into the dark cedar closet in his home office. 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang, and I heard my husband's voice. And what came next shattered my reality into pieces. "My name is Jada, and I am 34 years old." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your heart ripped out by the people you trusted most. My career as a forensic financial auditor taught me one thing above all else. Numbers never lie, but people always do. I investigate white-collar criminals for a living. I track hidden offshore accounts, uncover shell companies, and dismantle corporate fraud. I am used to looking at the darkest parts of human greed. I just never expected to find that absolute greed sitting right in my own living room. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta. I had left the office early to drop off some tax documents for my father, Harold. He had always been my rock, a gentleman who worked incredibly hard to provide a beautiful life for our family. But when he opened his heavy wooden front door that day, the blood had completely drained from his face. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling violently as he yanked me inside the foyer. Without a word of explanation, he pushed me into the louvered closet in his study, begging me in a frantic whisper not to make a single sound. I stood in the pitch-black dark, surrounded by the smell of old paper and cedar wood, completely confused and terrified for his safety. Then I heard heavy footsteps entering the room. I recognized the smooth, confident voice immediately. It was Marcus, my husband of 6 years. He was a high-profile financial investment director, charming, exceptionally handsome, and fiercely ambitious. But the tone he used now was cold, calculated, and vicious. Following him into the room was my younger sister, Tasha. Tasha was my mother's undisputed golden child, a woman who cared only about designer labels, social climbing, and maintaining her flawless image. And walking in right behind them was Trent, Tasha's husband. Trent was born into old money, a wealthy white family from Savannah. He constantly looked down his nose at us, carrying an air of racial and class superiority that my mother practically worshipped. Through the narrow wooden slats of the closet door, I watched my husband slam my 62-year-old father against the heavy mahogany desk. Marcus grabbed my father tightly by the collar, his face twisted in absolute rage. "You are going to sign the Oak Bluffs property over to Trent's holding company right now," Marcus threatened. The words made my blood run completely cold. Oak Bluffs was our family's heritage property in Martha's Vineyard, a historic and incredibly valuable piece of real estate that had been in our family for generations. My father pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation. He told Marcus he could not do it, that it was the only legacy he had left to pass down. Marcus laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed in the large room. "If you do not sign it, Harold, I will hand these files over to the federal authorities today. I have spent the last 8 months funneling $3 million from your corporate accounts into offshore shells. My digital trail makes it look exactly like you did it. You will spend the rest of your life rotting in a federal penitentiary." I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. My own husband had embezzled millions and was actively framing my father to steal our family legacy. But the horror did not stop there. Tasha walked right up to Marcus, wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, and kissed him passionately. It was not a quick peck. It was the deep, familiar kiss of two people who had been sharing a bed for a very long time. I stopped breathing entirely. My sister and my husband. I shifted my shocked gaze to Trent, fully expecting him to explode in anger at the sight of his wife kissing another man in broad daylight. Instead, Trent calmly poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, leaned against the bookshelf, and smirked. He took a slow sip and told Marcus to hurry up and get the signature so they could leave. Trent did not care about the affair at all. His ancestral venture capital firm was secretly drowning in massive debt, bleeding money due to his own sheer incompetence. Trent was actively allowing my husband to sleep with his wife because Marcus was using those stolen funds to secretly bail out Trent's failing business. It was a vile transaction. Trent traded his dignity to maintain his white privilege and old money facade, all funded by a black man's stolen millions. Any other woman might have burst out of that closet, crying, screaming, and demanding answers for the betrayal. But I did not shed a single tear. The shock was instantly replaced by a glacial, overwhelming calm. My auditor instincts took over completely. I pulled my phone from my pocket, turned the screen brightness all the way down, and opened my voice recording application. I captured every single threat, every admission of guilt, every disgusting sound of their betrayal. Then, moving silently in the shadows, I opened my secure federal banking application. Using my clearance, I triggered an immediate, irrevocable security freeze on all my personal assets and the hidden accounts my husband knew absolutely nothing about. I locked down my entire financial world in less than 60 seconds. Marcus forced my weeping father to sign the property transfer documents. Tasha laughed out loud, calling our father a weak old fool who deserved to lose everything. Trent finished his bourbon, placed the crystal glass on the desk, and told them all to get back to the country club before anyone noticed they were missing. I waited in the dark for 10 full minutes after the heavy front door finally closed. When I stepped out of the closet, my father was slumped on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into his hands. He looked up at me, apologizing repeatedly, saying he had ruined everything to keep himself out of prison. I knelt beside him, my face a mask of absolute resolve. I took his trembling hands in mine and helped him stand up. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with a terrifying calmness. "Do not cry, Dad. They just made the biggest mistake of their miserable lives. They forgot what I do for a living." The very next day I dressed for our traditional Sunday family dinner, as if my entire world had not just been shattered. My mother Vivian hosted these elaborate dinners every single week at her sprawling estate in Buckhead. Vivian was a woman dangerously obsessed with social climbing. Her entire existence revolved around her status in Atlanta's black elite circles, her exclusive country club memberships, and projecting an image of absolute untouchable perfection. She had always viewed my practical nature and my corporate career as a massive disappointment. Tasha, with her flashy lifestyle brand and her old money white husband, was the trophy daughter Vivian proudly paraded around town. I walked into the grand dining room wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my expression perfectly neutral. The crystal chandelier cast a warm, expensive glow over the lavishly set table. Tasha sat across from me, glowing and radiant in a designer dress, chatting loudly about a recent luxury shopping trip to Paris. Trent sat beside her, swirling his red wine with an air of immense privileged boredom. Marcus was seated to my right, flawlessly playing the role of the devoted, loving husband. He smiled at me warmly, pulled my chair out, and gently rubbed my shoulder as I sat down. Every single time his hand touched me, my skin crawled with disgust, but I maintained a pleasant, unwavering smile. Vivian brought out the main course, immediately directing all her fawning attention to Trent. She kissed up to him, constantly asking about his family's historic estate in Savannah and praising his supposedly brilliant business acumen. She then turned her highly critical gaze toward me, her lips pressing into a thin, disappointed line. "Jada, are you really wearing that boring corporate suit to Sunday dinner again? You look like a bank teller. You are actively embarrassing Marcus. Hi is a rising star in the financial world, and you dress like you are about to audit a grocery store." I simply took a bite of my roasted asparagus and nodded politely, refusing to take the bait. Marcus chuckled, leaning in to kiss my cheek. He told my mother to leave me alone, saying he loved his hardworking wife. But as he leaned away from me, I glanced down. Under the edge of the mahogany dining table, his phone screen was brightly illuminated. He was actively texting Tasha, who sat directly across from us. I watched Tasha look down at her lap, smile wickedly, and type a quick response. During dessert, Marcus cleared his throat and placed a warm hand over mine on the table. "Jada baby, the market is shifting rapidly right now. I have been looking at our joint accounts, but I really need the passwords to your private investment portfolio. I can optimize your assets, roll them into a high-yield trust I am setting up to protect the family. It is the smartest financial move we can make right now to secure our future." I knew exactly what he was doing. Having drained my father's corporate accounts, he was now moving to empty my life savings before filing for a sudden divorce. Trent let out a loud, condescending scoff from across the table. He pointed his silver dessert fork directly at me. "You should really listen to your husband, Jada. Macroeconomics is a highly complex game. It is definitely not for corporate bean counters. Let the men handle the real money before you cost Marcus his entire future. The room went completely quiet, waiting for me to absorb the heavy insult. My mother nodded in eager agreement with Trent, looking at me expectantly, waiting for me to submit. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, took a very slow sip of my red wine, and set the crystal glass down precisely on its coaster. I looked directly into Trent's arrogant blue eyes and smiled a cold, calculating smile. Macroeconomics is fascinating, Trent, I said, my voice carrying clearly and sharply across the silent room. But I greatly prefer forensic accounting. It is truly amazing what you can find when you follow the digital paper trail. For instance, it is quite complex trying to understand the $2 million missing from your family's ancestral trust account last month, or how your failing venture capital firm has not turned a single dollar of profit in 3 years. Tell me, Trent, does your father know you are entirely bankrupt? The color instantly drained from Trent's face. His silver fork clattered loudly onto his fine china plate. He choked on his own breath, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated panic. Tasha jumped up from her dining chair, her face flushed with sudden defensive rage. She screamed at me, demanding to know what kind of jealous lies I was spewing at the dinner table. Before I could answer her, my mother slammed her hands on the table and marched aggressively over to me. Her face was contorted with absolute fury. "How dare you disrespect your brother-in-law in my house?" Vivian shrieked at the top of her lungs. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin your sister's perfect life because your own life is so horribly pathetic." She raised her hand high and slapped me incredibly hard across the left cheek. The sharp crack echoed loudly through the dining room. My head snapped to the side, my skin burning fiercely from the impact. The entire room froze in shock. I did not raise my hand to touch my face. I did not cry out. I slowly turned my head back to look at the woman who had given birth to me. Her eyes were wild with misplaced rage, fiercely protecting the very people who were actively planning to throw her into a state-run nursing home and steal everything she owned. "Get out of my house right now," Vivian commanded, pointing a trembling manicured finger toward the front door. "I never want to see your miserable face at this table again." I calmly stood up, smoothed the invisible wrinkles from my charcoal suit, and picked up my purse. I did not say a single word to her. I walked deliberately through the grand foyer and out the heavy oak front doors into the cool evening air. As I reached my car in the driveway, I heard the front door open behind me. Marcus came running out, putting on a frantic, highly convincing display of husbandly concern. "Jada, wait!" He grabbed my arm, feigning deep distress. "Baby, she did not mean it. You know how she gets when she is stressed about keeping up appearances. Just come back inside, apologize to Trent, and we can fix this. Please just talk to me." I stopped and turned to face the man I had slept next to for 6 years. I looked at his handsome, lying face, knowing with absolute certainty that he had just conspired to destroy my family and steal my future. I stepped much closer to him, invading his personal space, until I could smell the expensive cologne I had bought him for our anniversary. I leaned in, my lips brushing against his ear, and whispered softly into the quiet night. "I bought a $50,000 Cartier diamond necklace yesterday afternoon, Marcus. The transaction cleared at 2:15, but my neck is completely empty tonight, so tell me, darling husband, exactly who is wearing it." I pulled back and watched the absolute terror wash over his face. His jaw dropped open, and he stood completely frozen on the concrete driveway, unable to form a single coherent word. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and drove away into the dark night, leaving him to realize that his perfect crime was unraveling and the real war had just begun. By the time I pulled into the secure parking garage of my luxury high-rise condominium, it was past midnight. I did not go to sleep. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and opened my secure laptop. My phone began vibrating relentlessly across the granite kitchen counter. I glanced at the glowing screen to see a tidal wave of missed calls and text messages flooding in. Marcus had wasted absolutely no time. Panicking over my discovery, he had immediately launched a preemptive strike. He had called my mother, sobbing uncontrollably, playing the role of the terrified, devoted husband. He spun a masterful lie, claiming I was suffering from severe paranoid delusions and experiencing a total psychological breakdown. Vivian devoured the lie instantly. It fit perfectly into her preferred narrative that I was the flawed, defective daughter. Within an hour, she had mobilized her entire network of high society church friends from Buckhead. My voicemail box filled up with sanctimonious messages from women I had known since childhood. They called to pray for my troubled soul while simultaneously shaming me. They accused me of being a bitter, barren wife who was actively trying to destroy her sister's perfect marriage out of pure spite. They told me I needed serious psychiatric help and urged me to submit to my husband's guidance before I ruined my own life. I listened to 3 of those voicemails before calmly switching my phone to airplane mode. Let them talk. Gossip was the currency of their hollow world, but cold, hard data was the currency of mine. I packed a fresh suit and drove straight to my downtown office building long before the sun even considered rising. As a senior forensic auditor, I had federal clearance levels that Trent and Marcus could not even begin to comprehend. I swiped my badge past the armed security desk and locked myself inside my glass-walled office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. I logged into the secure federal financial database and began ripping their carefully constructed facade to shreds. I started with Trent's ancestral trust accounts. Trent had always paraded his old money heritage like a weapon, but the digital trail painted a pathetic picture of desperate ruin. His family's venture capital firm was completely insolvent. To save face, Trent had allowed Marcus to orchestrate a massive money laundering operation using my father's corporate accounts as the primary funding source. But the stolen money needed a clean place to land before Trent could use it. That was where my golden child sister came in. I pulled up the tax records and corporate filings for Tasha's highly publicized luxury lifestyle brand. Vivian constantly bragged about Tasha's entrepreneurial genius to anyone who would listen. Tasha's boutique sold overpriced candles, organic linen robes, and imported skincare to Atlanta's elite. But as I ran the inventory numbers against the reported revenue, a massive glaring discrepancy emerged. The boutique was reporting millions of dollars in monthly cash sales for products they did not even have in stock. It was a textbook shell company. Tasha was not a brilliant businesswoman. She was a glorified money mule. Marcus was funneling my father's stolen retirement funds straight through the boutique's registers, washing the dirty money clean before transferring it to Trent's failing firm. And Tasha was taking a hefty percentage right off the top to fund her lavish lifestyle. I spent the next 6 hours compiling every wire transfer, every fake invoice, and every forged signature into a comprehensive digital dossier. By 9 in the morning, I had a bulletproof case of federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. I was just reviewing the final summary report when the heavy glass door of my office forcefully swung open. Tasha stormed into the room, ignoring the protests of my executive assistant who was chasing right behind her. I waved my assistant away and told her it was fine. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone with my sister. Tasha looked immaculate, dressed in a tailored white designer jumpsuit, her hair perfectly blown out. But her eyes were wild with cornered animal panic. And resting right against her collarbone, sparkling under the fluorescent office lights, was the $50,000 Cartier diamond necklace Marcus had purchased 2 days ago. She slammed her expensive leather handbag onto my desk. "You have lost your absolute mind, Jada," Tasha hissed, leaning over my desk with a venomous glare. "Marcus called Mom crying this morning. He said you are having a complete psychotic break. He is terrified of you. Mom is currently looking into involuntary psychiatric hold procedures. We will have you locked in a hospital ward by tonight if you do not stop this insane jealousy." I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers together. I let my eyes slowly travel from her furious face down to the brilliant diamonds resting on her chest. "You are wearing my husband's guilty conscience, Tasha," I said softly. "It is a beautiful piece. Tell me, did he buy it for you before or after you two decided to frame our father for federal embezzlement?" Tasha flinched, her hand flying instinctively up to cover the necklace. The arrogant sneer melted off her face, replaced by genuine fear. "You are crazy," she stammered, taking a step back. "You do not know what you are talking about. You need to sign your portfolio passwords over to Marcus right now before you force us to commit you. You are sick, Jada. I am highly educated, Tasha. I corrected her, maintaining absolute stillness. I turned my monitor around so she could see the screen. Displayed in bright, bold letters was the official submission portal for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The attachment loaded into the portal was titled Lifestyle Brand Audit Summary. I watched Tasha's eyes dart rapidly across the screen, reading the staggering numbers of her fraudulent inventory and the exact routing details of the offshore accounts. The blood rushed out of her face, leaving her looking gray and sickly. "You are a puppet, Tasha." I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm register. "Trent is using Marcus. Marcus is using you. And you are so desperate to maintain your country club image that you let them turn you into a federal felon." "Please," Tasha whispered, her voice suddenly trembling. The bravado completely shattered. "Jada, you cannot do this. Trent will kill us. He will ruin the family." "You ruined the family the moment you let my husband into your bed," I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. I reached out and rested my index finger on the enter key of my keyboard. I looked her dead in the eyes, watching her breathe in shallow, terrified gasps. "I just submitted your boutique's tax discrepancies to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division," I said, pressing the key down with a decisive, audible click. The screen flashed green, confirming the upload was successful. I smiled warmly at my sister, leaning forward over the desk. "Nice necklace, by the way. Make sure you declare it as income before they freeze your assets." Tasha let out a choked, desperate sound that was half sob and half scream. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the carpet as she scrambled for the door handle. She ripped the door open and fled down the corporate hallway, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. I turned my monitor back to face me and took a slow, satisfying sip of my black coffee. The smear campaign was officially over. Now it was time to let the federal government do what they did best. I left my office building exactly at noon, stepping out into the oppressive Atlanta heat. The adrenaline from my confrontation with Tasha was still coursing through my veins, but I needed to clear my head before executing my next strategic move. I walked 2 blocks down Peachtree Street and stepped into a high-end artisanal coffee lounge favored by the corporate elite. The air inside was cool, heavy with the scent of roasted espresso and quiet wealth. I ordered a sparkling water and took a seat in a secluded leather booth facing the large floor-to-ceiling windows. I needed a moment of absolute silence to review my father's legal defense strategy. That silence did not last long. Trent slid into the booth directly across from me without asking for permission. He did not bother ordering a drink. He just stared at me with eyes that were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of the polite charm he usually faked at my mother's dinner table. He wore a tailored linen suit that screamed old money, a casual display of generational wealth meant to intimidate anyone who had to actually work for a living. He leaned back against the expensive leather upholstery, crossing his arms over his chest, and let out a slow, patronizing sigh. "We need to have a serious conversation, Jada," Trent said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tasha just called me in absolute hysterics. You have severely overplayed your hand today. You think you are being clever with these little tax reports, but you are stepping into an arena you do not understand." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, maintaining steady, unbroken eye contact. "I understand perfectly, Trent. I am watching a group of desperate criminals panic because the lights just turned on." Trent leaned forward, placing his elbows on the polished wood table. He dropped his Southern gentleman act completely and leaned heavily into his racial and class privilege. He looked at me not as a sister-in-law, but as a nuisance he could easily swat away. "Listen to me very carefully," Trent said, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. "My family built this city. We own the real estate, the shipping lines, and half the politicians sitting in the state capitol. You are a middle-class auditor who works in a cubicle. Your father is a weak old man who willingly signed his life away. We will crush you and your cowardly father before you even eat lunch today. I can have you blacklisted from every accounting firm in the Southeast. I can have your father tied up in federal litigation until he dies of old age. You do not win this." He reached inside his tailored jacket pocket, pulled out a pristine checkbook, and clicked a silver fountain pen. He quickly scrawled a number, signed his name, and tore the check from the binding. He slid the crisp piece of paper across the polished table, stopping right in front of my glass. $100,000, Trent said, tapping the paper with his index finger. Take the money. Divorce. Marcus quietly and walk away. You drop this ridiculous crusade, you withdraw whatever you sent to the authorities, and you go back to your quiet little life. Consider it a generous severance package from my family to yours. I looked down at the check. The amount was insulting, but the arrogant assumption that I could be bought off so cheaply was infuriating. I reached out and picked up the piece of paper, holding it between my fingers. I looked Trent dead in the eye and saw the smug satisfaction radiating from his face. He truly believed his white privilege and his family name made him completely invincible. I deliberately ripped the check straight down the middle. I stacked the two pieces together and tore them again. I kept tearing the thick paper until it was nothing more than useless confetti. I opened my hand and let the pieces flutter down directly into my glass of water, watching the ink bleed and dissolve into a murky puddle. Your family has money, Trent, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal frozen whisper. But you do not. Trent frowned, his smug expression faltering for the very first time. You are a failed white boy, surviving off the scraps of a greedy black man. I continued, leaning in closer so he could hear every single devastating syllable. I looked at your trust accounts this morning, Trent. Your grandfather locked you out of the primary dividends 3 years ago because you ran your first company into the ground. Your current venture capital firm has zero liquid assets. You are completely broke. Your ancestral wealth is a mirage, and your business is a hollow shell waiting to be repossessed. You are letting my husband sleep with your wife because Marcus is the only thing keeping you from declaring bankruptcy. You are nothing but a pathetic parasite. The truth hit him like a physical blow. His face turned a dangerous, violent shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive collar. His white fragility shattered completely under the weight of his own exposed failure. You shut your mouth, Trent hissed, his voice shaking with uncontrollable rage. You are a fraud, Trent, I said, smiling a razor-thin smile. And by tomorrow morning, everyone in your elite little circle will know that you fund your lifestyle with stolen retirement money. Trent lost his mind. He stood up so fast his chair slammed violently into the wall behind him. He let out a furious guttural scream, grabbed the heavy wooden cafe table with both hands and flipped it completely over. Sparkling water, porcelain cups, and shattered glass exploded across the floor. The loud crash silenced the entire coffee shop. Baristas froze behind the counter. Customers gasped and backed away in terror. Trent stood over the ridge, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides, glaring down at me with pure murderous intent. I will destroy you, he screamed at the top of his lungs, pointing a shaking finger at my face. I will ruin your entire life. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I remained perfectly calm, seated in my booth amidst the chaos of broken glass and spilled water. I simply raised my right hand and pointed to the large circular booth located directly behind where Trent had just been sitting. Trent spun around to look. Sitting in that booth, holding a cup of black coffee and staring at Trent with absolute unshielded disgust, was Harrison Sterling. Harrison was the billionaire prospective investor Trent had been desperately courting for the last 6 months to save his firm. I had anonymously emailed Harrison's assistant 2 hours ago suggesting he visit this exact coffee shop to witness a crucial business development. Harrison slowly stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and shook his head in silent contempt. He did not say a word to Trent. He just turned and walked out the front door of the cafe, taking Trent's last hope of financial survival with him. Trent stood paralyzed in the middle of the coffee shop, staring at the door in absolute horror. He realized his deal was dead. His firm was dead. His entire life was unraveling in real time, before I could even enjoy the look of total despair on Trent's face. My phone began vibrating frantically in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a rapid succession of digital notifications lighting up the screen. Marcus was retaliating with brutal speed. The first notification was from my bank, showing our joint checking and savings accounts had been frozen and completely drained of funds. The second notification was from my smart home security application, informing me that my administrative access had been permanently revoked and the digital locks on my front door had been changed. The third notification was an email from a prominent cutthroat law firm in Atlanta. The subject line read, "Immediate petition for dissolution of marriage." Marcus had locked me out, cut me off, and filed for divorce. The war had officially escalated to the point of no return. I drove straight to the sprawling suburban estate Marcus and I shared for 6 years. The iron gates were wide open. As I pulled my SUV up the circular driveway, I saw the aftermath of my husband's cowardly retaliation. Scattered across our manicured front lawn were dozens of heavy black garbage bags. Some had ripped open, spilling my custom-tailored suit's designer shoes and personal keepsakes onto the damp grass. Standing at the top of the grand brick staircase were two people. Marcus stood with his arms crossed over his chest, wearing a sickeningly smug grin. Right next to him, gripping her expensive leather handbag like a weapon, was my mother. Vivian looked down at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. I shifted my car into park, stepped out, and walked slowly up the pathway. I did not rush. I did not scramble to pick up my scattered clothes. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my face completely blank. "Marcus told me everything," Vivian shouted before I reached the bottom step. Her voice was sharp and filled with venom. "He told me you are actively trying to frame him to cover up your father's disgusting embezzlement. He showed me the financial transfers you fabricated. I knew you were jealous of your sister Jada, but trying to send an innocent man to federal prison to protect a thief is beyond evil." I stopped at the base of the stairs and looked at the woman who had given birth to me. She had not bothered to ask for my side of the story. She had not investigated a single claim. She simply took the word of a smooth-talking liar because it fit her desperate need to protect her precious social standing and her golden child. "You are a disgrace to this family," Vivian continued, her face contorting with rage. "Tasha called me in tears this morning, saying you threatened her business. You are completely unhinged. I am so thankful Marcus had the sense to freeze your accounts and lock you out before you could do any more damage. You are dead to me, Jada. Do not ever call me again." Marcus stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Vivian's shoulder. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. He was waiting for the breakdown. He expected me to fall to my knees, to cry, to scream, to beg my mother for forgiveness, and plead with him to let me back inside my own house. He wanted the chaotic emotional reaction of a broken woman so he could use it as further proof of my supposed mental instability. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a single word in my defense. The heavy silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I stared directly into Marcus's eyes, and I let him see the bottomless, terrifying calm of a woman who had already secured his total destruction. His smug smile began to waver. The confident posture he held so easily started to crack. He shifted his weight nervously, his hand dropping from my mother's shoulder. He knew my capabilities better than anyone. He knew that if I was not fighting back right now, it was because the fight was already over, and he had already lost. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a premium concierge moving service I kept on retainer. I gave them the address and authorized a rapid response cleanup, using a secure, untraceable routing number from my blind trust. I walked over to the largest intact garbage bag, which contained my most essential work documents and a few changes of clothes, and effortlessly lifted it into the back of my SUV. Jada, Marcus called out, his voice suddenly lacking its previous arrogance. "Did you hear what your mother just said?" I ignored him completely. I closed the trunk of my car, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. I rolled the window down just enough to make eye contact one last time. I looked at Vivian, who seemed genuinely unnerved by my lack of reaction. Then I looked at Marcus, whose face was now pale with creeping anxiety. I did not go to a friend's house or a cheap motel. I drove straight to the most exclusive, high-security luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta. I walked up to the marble reception desk and booked their top-floor penthouse suite for the entire month. When the concierge asked for a payment method, I handed him a solid black metal card linked directly to an offshore account that Marcus and Trent could never dream of accessing. The transaction cleared instantly. I took the private elevator up to the penthouse, dropped my bags in the expansive foyer, and immediately set up my workstation on the sleek glass dining table. The panoramic view of the city was breathtaking, but I had zero time to admire it. I opened my encrypted laptop, entered my dual authentication credentials, and initiated a highly secure video conference link. The screen flickered to life. Three faces appeared on my monitor in sharp high definition. Sitting in the center frame was Richard, the senior managing partner at my auditing firm. Sitting on either side of him were two stone-faced federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. They had been reviewing the massive data dump I sent them earlier that morning concerning Trent's ancestral trust, Marcus's fraudulent transfers, and Tasha's shell company boutique. Richard leaned forward into his webcam, his expression deadly serious, but gleaming with professional satisfaction. "We have thoroughly reviewed the digital dossier you provided, Jada. The evidence is absolutely flawless. We have secured the federal warrants for search, seizure, and immediate arrest. The paperwork is signed by a federal judge." The lead agent on the right adjusted his earpiece and looked directly into the camera. "We have the warrants, Jada. Tell us when to drop the hammer." I told the federal agents through the encrypted video link. I leaned back in my penthouse chair watching the live feed. The trap was set and the prey was putting on her best dress. Across town at an exclusive event space in Buckhead, the champagne flowed freely. Tasha was hosting the highly publicized spring collection launch for her luxury lifestyle brand. The room was packed with Atlanta elite and wealthy socialites. Flashbulbs illuminated the grand ballroom. Waiters circulated with crystal trays of imported truffles. Standing right at the center of the spectacle was my mother. Vivian wore a custom emerald gown, holding a glass of vintage champagne, laughing loudly with the wives of local politicians. She was in her absolute element, basking in the reflected glory of her golden child. "Look at my Tasha," Vivian announced to a circle of wealthy donors. "She is a visionary. She built this entire empire with her own brilliant mind. It is a blessing to have a daughter who understands hard work and family legacy. Not everyone in my family shares that drive, unfortunately. Some people simply lack the pedigree for success." She took a sip of champagne, making sure everyone understood exactly who she was insulting. Meanwhile, Tasha posed for photographs in front of a massive wall of white roses. She wore a diamond tiara and the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she was completely untouchable. Trent stood near the bar looking physically ill and sweating through his designer suit after our encounter at the coffee shop. But Tasha was too self-absorbed to notice her husband crumbling. Marcus worked the room, shaking hands, projecting the image of the ultimate supportive brother-in-law. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, tapping a silver spoon against his flute. The crowd quieted down, turning their attention to the stage. "Let us gather around the grand entrance. My beautiful sister-in-law is about to cut the ribbon on her newest collection." The audience applauded as Tasha stepped up to a thick velvet ribbon stretched across the double doors. She was handed a pair of oversized golden ceremonial scissors. She flashed a blinding rehearsed smile at the flashing cameras. "This is for everyone who believed in my vision," Tasha proclaimed loudly. She lowered the scissors to the velvet ribbon. Before the blades could even touch the fabric, the heavy glass doors of the venue violently burst open. The heavy thud of combat boots echoed over the upbeat party music. 24 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with IRS criminal investigation stenciled across their backs swarmed the elegant ballroom. They moved with terrifying military precision. "Step away from the merchandise and take your hands off the registers," the lead agent bellowed into a bullhorn. "By order of a federal judge, this business is currently being seized, pending an active investigation into money laundering and tax fraud. Nobody move." The ballroom erupted into pure chaos. The elegant string quartet stopped playing instantly. Women in expensive gowns screamed and spilled their drinks. Tasha dropped the golden scissors, and they clattered onto the marble floor. She stood completely paralyzed, staring in wide-eyed horror as agents marched right past her. They ripped open the elegant display cases, tossing her overpriced organic candles and linen robes into heavy plastic evidence bags. They confiscated the boutique cash registers, ripping the power cords straight out of the walls. Two agents walked directly to the back office and emerged carrying Tasha's business laptops, placing them into secure anti-static evidence boxes. "What are you doing?" Tasha shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. "You cannot do this. My husband is a venture capitalist. Do you know who my family is? Get your hands off my inventory." She lunged forward, trying to grab a laptop box. The agent smoothly sidestepped her and pointed a stern warning finger at her face. "Ma'am, if you interfere with a federal search and seizure, I will put you in handcuffs right now and charge you with obstruction of justice. Back away." Tasha froze, realizing the agent was absolutely serious. She looked out into the crowd of Atlanta elite, hoping for someone to intervene. Instead, she saw a nightmare. Every single influencer and socialite in the room had their smartphones out. They were live streaming the entire raid to millions of followers. The cameras recorded Tasha's utter humiliation in high definition. Vivian realized the sheer magnitude of the social disaster unfolding. The women she had just been bragging to were now whispering and pointing phones directly at her. Vivian dropped her glass, turning her back to the cameras. She grabbed her designer clutch and desperately tried to hide her face, rushing blindly toward the coat check to escape the glaring humiliation. The pristine image she spent decades building was burning to the ground on live internet feeds. Tasha pushed her way through the panicked crowd, fleeing out the kitchen exit and stumbling into the dark alley behind the venue. She hyperventilated, gasping for air, as the cold reality of federal prison closed in around her. Her hands shook violently as she dialed Marcus. He answered on the first ring, breathing heavily. He had sprinted out a side door the moment he saw the federal windbreakers. "Marcus, you have to fix this." Tasha sobbed hysterically, pacing the dirt. "They took everything. The laptops have the offshore routing numbers. They are going to see the transfers. They are going to arrest me, Marcus. You promised me this was safe." Marcus stood in the shadows of the adjacent parking garage, staring at his own shaking hands. The arrogance that usually defined him was completely gone. This was not a random audit. Marcus finally understood the terrifying truth. Jada was not having a mental breakdown. She was systematically dismantling their criminal empire piece by piece with lethal precision. "Tasha, listen to me!" Marcus barked, his voice frantic. "Jada is behind this. She found the money trail. Trent is bankrupt and the boutique is gone. We have absolutely zero liquid capital left to fight a federal indictment." "What do we do?" Tasha cried, wiping ruined mascara from her face. "We need leverage right now." Marcus said, his mind racing through the shrinking list of options. "We need an asset so massive we can use it to secure immediate offshore loans and flee the jurisdiction. We need the Oak Bluffs estate. I am going to your parents' house tonight. I am going to force your cowardly father to sign that deed over to me right now. If he refuses, I will break his hands and forge the signature myself. Do not go back to your house, Tasha. Just disappear and wait for my call." Marcus hung up the phone, staring into the dark garage. He was a trapped rat, acting on pure survival instinct. He decided to play his final desperate card, completely unaware that I was already anticipating his next move. Marcus did not bother knocking when he arrived at my father's house in the quiet Atlanta suburbs an hour later. He kicked the heavy oak door open with enough force to shatter the deadbolt. He was not alone. Flanking him were two massive men in cheap suits, hired muscle paid for, with the very last remnants of his drained credit cards. My father was sitting in his study reading when the men burst in. Harold stood up in alarm, but the two thugs immediately grabbed his arms and slammed him back down into the leather chair. Marcus slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the desk right over my father's open book. "Sign the deed!" Harold Marcus barked, his face covered in a desperate layer of sweat. "Sign the Oak Bluffs property over to Trent's holding company right now, or I swear I will have my contacts at the Federal Bureau arrest you before midnight. I have the paper trail ready to go. You will die in a federal prison." My father looked at the documents and then at the violent men restraining him. He refused to pick up the pen. "You are a monster, Marcus," my father said, his voice shaking but defiant. "I will not hand over my family's heritage to save your pathetic skin." Marcus sneered and signaled his hired muscle. The two men hauled my father out of his chair and dragged him forcefully out the front door. They shoved him into the back of a dark gray SUV. Marcus jumped into the driver's seat. He had a corrupt notary waiting at a shady law office on the outskirts of the city, a man who would gladly rubber stamp a coerced signature for the right price. Marcus sped out of the neighborhood, tires screeching against the asphalt, believing he had just secured his golden ticket to freedom. What Marcus did not know was that I was watching his every single move in real time from the command center in my hotel penthouse. I had anticipated a physical escalation the moment I froze the bank accounts. 3 days ago, I had slipped a micro GPS tracker directly into the lining of my father's leather wallet. A bright red dot was currently moving at 80 miles per hour down Interstate 20. I did not call the local police. I needed Marcus caught in the absolute act of extortion, but I also needed to handle this with surgical precision. I picked up my phone and called the tactical security firm I kept on heavy retainer for high-risk corporate audits. I need an immediate vehicle interception, I told the security chief. Interstate 20 heading west. 3 hostile targets, 1 hostage. Do not let that vehicle reach the city limits. I threw on a sleek black trench coat and rushed down to the hotel lobby where my own security detail was already waiting in a reinforced black SUV. We tore onto the highway, merging into the heavy Atlanta night traffic. I kept my eyes glued to the tracking tablet, communicating coordinates to the intercept team. 10 minutes later, we caught up to them. Marcus was weaving recklessly through the lanes, desperate to reach his corrupt notary. He never even saw the trap closing around him. 2 heavy-duty security vehicles, completely blacked out, flanked Marcus's SUV on both sides. A third security vehicle pulled directly in front of him, cutting off his lane. My driver pulled up close behind him, boxing him in completely. The tactical drivers executed a flawless rolling roadblock, forcing Marcus's vehicle to slow down and eventually scrape against the concrete shoulder of the highway. Marcus slammed on the brakes, cursing violently, as the SUV jerked to a sudden halt. Before he or his hired thugs could even process what was happening, my security team swarmed their vehicle. 6 highly trained former military operatives surrounded the car with floodlights blinding the occupants inside. I stepped out of my vehicle into the humid night air. The highway traffic whizzed past us, but in our isolated pocket on the shoulder, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I walked deliberately up to the passenger side window where my father was pinned between the 2 thugs. "Open the doors, Marcus," I demanded, my voice slicing through the heavy rumble of the highway. Marcus glared at me through the windshield, his eyes wide with absolute panic and feral rage. He realized his cheap hired muscle was severely outgunned by my elite corporate security. The thugs in the back seat raised their hands in immediate surrender, wanting absolutely no part of a federal kidnapping charge. They unlatched the doors and stumbled out of the vehicle, running off into the dark embankment without a second backward glance. I reached into the back seat and gently pulled my father out of the car. Harold was breathing heavily, adjusting his wrinkled jacket, but he was physically unharmed. I handed him off to my lead security agent, who escorted him to the safety of our armored vehicle. I walked around to the driver's side window and stared down at the man I used to call my husband. Marcus was clutching the steering wheel, his knuckles completely white. He was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. His grand master plan was burning to ash right in front of his eyes. "It is over, Marcus," I said, staring at him with absolute zero pity. "You have no money, you have no business, and you definitely do not have my father." Suddenly, a twisted, manic smile broke across Marcus's sweating face. He reached over to the passenger's seat and snatched up a thick manila folder. He rolled down his window just enough to shove the paperwork in my face. He laughed, a loud, hysterical sound that barely masked his total desperation. "You are too late, Jada," Marcus spat, waving the documents frantically. "You think you are so smart, but you lost. Look at the bottom line. I forced him to sign the deed in the car while we were driving. The notary is my guy. He will backdate the stamp and authenticate it. The Oak Bluffs estate belongs to Trent's holding company now. I am going to leverage this property tomorrow morning, secure a $50 million offshore loan, and disappear. You get nothing." He revved the engine of his SUV, preparing to speed away into the night with his stolen prize. He thought he had just delivered the ultimate killing blow to our family legacy. I did not reach for the papers. I did not try to stop him from driving away. I simply stood on the side of the highway, the red taillights of passing cars reflecting in my eyes, and I smiled. It was a bright, genuine smile that completely unsettled him for a fraction of a second before he slammed his foot on the gas and sped away, leaving a cloud of exhaust in his wake. I turned my back to the empty road and walked over to my armored vehicle. My father was sitting in the back seat, holding a bottle of water my security team had given him. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of residual fear and deep concern. "Jada," He took the deed, my father said, his voice trembling slightly. I am so sorry, baby. He threatened to kill me if I did not sign it in the car. He has the Oak Bluffs property. I climbed into the seat next to him and gently placed my hand over his. I looked at the man who had worked his entire life to build our family, and I let out a soft, relaxed laugh. I am not worried about that piece of paper, Dad, I said smoothly, leaning back against the leather headrest. Let Marcus take his fake deed to the billionaires tomorrow. Let him try to leverage it for cash. I turned to look at my father, my smile turning razor sharp. Did you tell him about the blind trust, Dad? My father leaned back against the plush leather seat of the armored security vehicle and let out a deep, booming laugh that shook his entire chest. The sheer relief washing over him was palpable and contagious. No, Jada, he gasped, wiping a tear of absolute joy from his eye. I let that arrogant fool believe he had just stolen the keys to the kingdom. He has absolutely no idea that the deed he forced me to sign under threat of violence is legally worthless. We drove back into the city, leaving Marcus on the side of the highway to celebrate his hollow victory. I settled my father into an adjoining suite at my luxury hotel, making sure my private security detail was permanently stationed right outside his door. The immediate physical threat was neutralized, but the corporate war was just beginning to escalate. The very next morning, I walked into the grand marble lobby of my downtown auditing firm precisely at 8 o'clock. I wore a sharply tailored crimson suit, projecting absolute authority and unshakable confidence. But the moment I stepped off the elevator onto my designated floor, the atmosphere felt incredibly thick and suffocating. My executive assistant rushed up to me, her face completely pale and her hands trembling, clutching a stack of morning reports. She whispered frantically that Richard, the senior managing partner, had called an emergency executive committee meeting the second he arrived. I was summoned to the main boardroom immediately. She warned me that the partners looked furious, pacing the halls with grim expressions, and that my job was entirely on the line. I thanked her, handed her my coat, and walked straight down the glass-paneled hallway, without a single ounce of hesitation. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom and stepped inside. Richard sat at the head of the massive conference table, flanked by the 4 top equity partners of the firm. Their faces were carved from stone, offering no polite greeting and zero warmth. Sitting in the exact center of the polished table was a high-tech conference speakerphone, its green light indicating an active connected call. Before I could even take a seat, a voice oozing with southern white privilege and unearned arrogance echoed loudly through the speaker. It was Trent. He was completely unaware that he was barking demands into a room full of brilliant legal and financial minds who dismantled corrupt corporate empires for a living. I am telling you, Richard, Trent drawled, his voice dripping with venom and entitlement. This woman is a complete and total liability to your prestigious firm. Jada is a mentally unstable, disgruntled sister-in-law who is currently experiencing a violent psychiatric breakdown. She is actively harassing my family, fabricating federal tax documents, and trying to ruin my venture capital firm simply because she is jealous of my flawless marriage to her sister. My family built the financial foundation of this entire city. You know exactly who my father is. You know exactly how much capital we control in the Southeast region. If you do not terminate her employment immediately, strip her of her federal auditing credentials, and publicly disavow her insane actions, my family will pull every single account we have with your firm by the end of the day. We will drag your corporate reputation through the mud and bury you in defamation lawsuits before the week is over. Fire her right now while I am on the phone. I stood perfectly still at the far end of the long mahogany table. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to defend myself against his ridiculous, baseless accusations. I kept my face an unreadable mask of absolute calm, making direct, unyielding eye contact with Richard. The partners watched me silently, assessing my reaction to a man threatening to destroy my entire career over a phone line. Trent continued his aggressive, unhinged rant, demanding that I be escorted out of the building by armed security, and threatening to call the local police if I ever came near his wife again. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who firmly believed his generational wealth made him completely invincible to real-world consequences. He demanded a verbal confirmation of my immediate termination, expecting the senior partners to bow down to his family name, just like everyone else in Atlanta always did. The large boardroom fell totally silent as Trent finally finished his tirade, leaving his heavy threat hanging in the chilled air conditioning. Richard looked at me, his expression completely unreadable. He slowly reached out his hand, hovering over the sleek conference console. With a deliberate, forceful press, he hit the mute button. The green light turned a solid, flashing red, cutting off Trent's heavy, angry breathing on the other end of the line. The grim, suffocating tension in the room instantly vanished. Richard's stone-cold expression broke into a sharp, incredibly predatory smile. The other equity partners leaned back in their expensive leather chairs, letting out quiet, highly satisfied chuckles. Richard reached down to the carpeted floor and lifted his heavy leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. The metallic snap of the brass latches echoed sharply in the large, silent room. He reached inside and pulled out a massive, heavily redacted binder, dropping it onto the table with a loud, resounding thud. He placed his hand flat on top of the thick binder and slid it all the way across the polished wood. The heavy file stopped right in front of me. I looked down at the cover, reading the bold black letters printed across the top. It was a highly classified federal case file code. Trent thinks he runs this city, Richard said, his voice vibrating with intense professional satisfaction. He thinks his old money pedigree makes him untouchable. He does not know that we have been quietly building a racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's case against his father's firm for 2 solid years. We have been meticulously tracking their predatory lending practices, their offshore tax evasion schemes, and their illegal network of shell companies. But we were missing the final piece of the puzzle connecting the personal family trusts to the corporate fraud. Your digital dossier yesterday gave us the exact routing numbers we desperately needed. Richard stood up and leaned his hands on the table, locking eyes with me. And now, thanks to this incredibly stupid phone call Trent just handed us, recorded audio proof of witness intimidation and corporate extortion, he just dug his own grave and asked us to push him in. I placed my hand on the heavy binder, feeling the immense weight of the justice waiting inside its pages. I looked at Richard, my own smile mirroring his predatory focus. "You are no longer a senior auditor," Jada, Richard announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Effective immediately, you are promoted to lead investigator on this federal task force. You have unrestricted access to all firm resources and full federal backing. Take this file. Take the audio from this phone call. Take every single piece of evidence you have gathered. Burn them down, Jada. Burn their entire empire straight to the ground." I walked out of the executive boardroom with the entire weight of the federal government behind me. The promotion to lead investigator was not just a title, it was a loaded weapon. I left the glass and steel skyscraper and returned straight to my secure penthouse suite at the luxury hotel. My private security detail nodded respectfully as I swiped my keycard and pushed open the heavy double doors. My father was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. He looked rested, his posture no longer slumped under the suffocating weight of Marcus's blackmail. I poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed him one, sitting down on the plush velvet sofa opposite him. I told him everything that had just transpired at the firm. I watched the profound relief wash over his face as I explained that Trent and Marcus were walking blindly into a federal trap. Harold took a slow sip of his water and set the glass down on the marble coffee table. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was a look of immense pride mixed with a sharp, calculating intelligence. "You are brilliant, Jada," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But you are not the only one who saw this disaster coming." My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "For decades, I let your mother parade me around her country club events. I played the quiet, accommodating husband because I wanted peace in my home. But I was never blind. I saw Vivian's vanity growing every single year. I watched her groom Tasha to value designer labels and high society status above basic human decency. When Tasha brought Trent home and your mother practically fainted over his old money-white pedigree, I knew our family legacy was in critical danger." He stood up and walked over to his suit jacket draped across a dining chair. He pulled a thick folded envelope from the inside pocket and handed it to me. "Oak Bluffs is not just a vacation home, Jada. My grandfather bought that land during segregation, when black families were not even allowed on public beaches. He built that estate with his bare hands. It represents our history, our blood, and our survival. I was never going to let a spoiled socialite and a racist trust fund baby turn my grandfather's sweat into collateral for their luxury lifestyle brand. Oak Bluffs is sacred ground for our community. It is where generations of our people found sanctuary when the rest of the country shut us out. Your mother only saw it as a status symbol to flaunt in front of her wealthy friends, but I always knew its true worth. I opened the heavy envelope and slid out a stack of dense legal documents. The header of the first page stopped my breath completely. It was an irrevocable blind trust agreement dated exactly 5 years ago. Read the beneficiary clause, my father instructed, a quiet triumph ringing in his voice. I scanned the complex legal jargon, my auditor brain instantly translating the financial structures. My eyes locked onto my own name. I was listed as the sole primary beneficiary and the exclusive controlling trustee. According to this document, my father had legally transferred the entirety of the Oak Bluffs estate into this trust half a decade ago. He completely relinquished his own ownership rights to protect the property from Vivian's reckless spending and Tasha's inevitable greed. My signature on that highway last night was entirely worthless, my father said, smiling a sharp, brilliant smile. Marcus put a gun to my head and forced me to sign over a property I do not even own. I do not have the legal authority to transfer a single blade of grass on that estate. You are the sole legal owner, Jada. You are the only person on earth who controls Oak Bluffs. The sheer magnitude of my father's brilliant deception hit me like a lightning bolt. Marcus was currently sitting in a private wealth management office, leveraging that exact forged deed. He was attempting to secure a $50 million offshore loan using a piece of paper that held absolutely zero legal weight. It was not just extortion anymore. Marcus was committing massive first-degree felony bank fraud in real time. Every signature he placed on those loan applications was adding another 10 years to his federal prison sentence. He was digging a grave so deep he would never see daylight again. "You protected us," I whispered, staring at the man I had always assumed was too gentle to fight back. "You outsmarted all of them. I protected the only daughter who actually respects where we came from," my father replied, placing his hand over mine. "Now you have the weapon you need to finish this." Before I could say another word, the heavy brass knocker on the penthouse door echoed through the suite. My security chief opened the door, checking a delivery before stepping inside. He handed me a thick, oversized envelope sealed with shimmering gold wax. The return address was stamped with the insignia of the Atlanta Heritage Gala, the most exclusive Black elite charity event of the entire year. It was an event notoriously hosted and aggressively gatekept by my mother. I cracked the wax seal and pulled out the opulent heavy cardstock invitation. Slipped inside the elegant gold lettering was a small piece of custom stationery. It was a handwritten note from Tasha. Her looping, arrogant handwriting practically jumped off the paper. "Come watch Marcus and me accept the Entrepreneur of the Year award tonight, loser. Try to wear something that does not look like it came from a discount rack." She actually believed they had won. She believed Trent had handled my firm, Marcus had secured the $50 million loan, and the entire city was about to bow down to their counterfeit empire. They were planning to use the biggest high society event of the season to publicly crown themselves as Atlanta's ultimate power couple. I stared at the petty, vicious note, feeling a cold, thrilling surge of absolute power coursing through my veins. The federal agents were standing by. The blind trust documents were in my hand. The entire web of their financial crimes was locked and loaded in my secure database. Tasha wanted an audience. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted me to watch her triumph. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my text messages. I typed a brief response directly to my golden child sister, sending it into the digital ether. Wouldn't miss it. The formal notification arrived via electronic courier at precisely 8 o'clock on a rainy Thursday morning. Two aggressive matrimonial attorneys hired by Marcus swept into the executive conference room of my auditing firm without an appointment. They dropped a heavy leather-bound petition for divorce onto my desk with an arrogant thud. The paperwork demanded immediate spousal support, claiming that I had fraudulently concealed marital assets and that Marcus was the helpless victim of my systematic financial abuse. The lead attorney, a slick man with an expensive tailored suit and a predatory smile, leaned over my desk. He warned me that if I attempted to contest their claims in court, they would expose my alleged mental instability, leak fabricated psychiatric reports to the press, and systematically ruin my professional reputation as a federal auditor. They wanted complete submission. They wanted me broken, penniless, and disgraced. Instead of screaming or calling security, I scheduled the mandatory pre-trial mediation meeting for the very next afternoon in a neutral lawyer's office downtown. When I pushed open the conference room door for the mediation session, I consciously transformed my entire demeanor. I discarded the sharp crimson power suits and the unyielding posture. I wore an oversized muted beige sweater that made me look fragile and washed out. I left my hair loose and completely unstyled, skipping makeup entirely so my face appeared pale and exhausted. When Marcus walked into the room accompanied by his two pit bull lawyers, he looked at me and flashed a wide, predatory grin. He saw a defeated, broken wife ready for slaughter. The mediation started exactly as Marcus planned. His lawyers dominated the room, shouting aggressive demands, slamming papers onto the table, and painting a theatrical picture of Marcus as an emotionally battered husband, trapped by a cold, hyper-intelligent career woman. They claimed I had hidden millions in offshore accounts and demanded complete control over all our shared financial portfolios. I played my role to absolute perfection. I bowed my head, stared fixedly at the polished wooden grain of the table, and let a few quiet, trembling tears roll down my cheeks. I kept my voice weak, shaky, and barely audible. I whimpered softly, murmuring that I just wanted this painful nightmare to end, that I could not bear the stress of a public trial, and that I was terrified of their threats to destroy my career. My performance was so convincing that Marcus's lead attorney actually patted Marcus on the back, with a condescending chuckle, treating the whole negotiation like a game they had already won. Marcus leaned forward, his arrogance swelling to dangerous proportions. He no longer saw me as a threat. He saw a pathetic, terrified woman he could easily manipulate. He pushed a revised settlement agreement across the table, whispering that he would show me mercy if I signed right away. The terms of his settlement were brazenly greedy. In exchange for supposedly sparing my career and waiving his right to raid my personal retirement funds, Marcus demanded full, unencumbered legal control of all upcoming real estate ventures, specifically naming our family holdings and commercial development rights. He was talking directly about the Oak Bluffs estate. He genuinely believed that if I signed this mediation paper, he would legally seize the $50 million property he had failed to steal from my father the night before. He thought he was locking down his golden parachute before the upcoming Atlanta Heritage Gala. I let out a weak, pathetic sniffle. I picked up a silver pen with a shaking hand, pretended to hesitate for dramatic effect, and slowly signed my legal name at the bottom of the document. Marcus could barely contain his euphoric gloating. He snatched the signed agreement off the table, checking my signature with wide, ecstatic eyes. He stood up abruptly, buttoning his suit jacket, and looked down at me with supreme contempt. "You always were too weak for this world," Jada, Marcus sneered, shaking his head in mock pity. "You thought you could play in the big leagues, but you ended up right where you belong, completely alone and holding nothing." He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, surrounded by his laughing legal team. As his lead attorney reached out to pull the door open, I stood up from my chair. The trembling was completely gone. My posture snapped straight, iron rigid. The weak, tearful voice vanished, replaced by a tone of absolute, chilling coldness. "Wait outside for a moment, counsel," I said clearly. Marcus stopped in his tracks, turning back with a confused scowl. He expected me to be weeping over my own stupidity. Instead, I reached into my beige sweater pocket, pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope sealed with red wax, and tossed it across the length of the conference table. It landed squarely in front of Marcus's lead lawyer. "What is this theatrical nonsense?" the lawyer snapped, eyeing the envelope suspiciously. I offered them a razor-thin, terrifying smile. "Open this after the gala tomorrow night," I told them, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Trust me, counsel. You are going to need the contents of that envelope very badly for your own criminal defense." The morning of the Atlanta Heritage Gala dawned with suffocating Georgia heat, but inside the sprawling grand ballroom of the exclusive country club, The air conditioning hummed a tune of absolute perfection. Vivian stood at the center of the massive room, barking frantic orders at a dozen terrified catering staff. She wore a silk emerald bathrobe pointing sharply at the crystal centerpieces, demanding they be aligned to the exact millimeter. She meticulously inspected every place card at the VIP tables, ensuring that the wealthiest surgeons and oldest politicians were seated closest to her family. This was her coronation. Tonight, she would officially cement her status as the matriarch of Atlanta's most successful affluent Black family. She adjusted the heavy diamond earrings on her neck, already practicing her gracious smile for the society photographers. Across the ballroom, Tasha and Marcus stood near the main stage, completely oblivious to the legal guillotine hanging directly over their heads. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored tuxedo, patting the inner pocket of his jacket, where he kept the fraudulently signed deed to the Oak Bluffs estate. He looked out over the sea of empty velvet chairs, imagining the billionaires who would fill them in just a few hours. He was preparing to announce his magnificent commercial resort project. He planned to use my father's stolen legacy to secure $50 million in immediate capital from the city's wealthiest investors. Tasha leaned against him, holding a crystal glass of mimosa, practicing her acceptance speech for the Entrepreneur of the Year award. She wore a blindingly expensive diamond tiara purchased with the stolen retirement funds she had washed through her sham boutique. Neither of them noticed Trent standing by the open bar. Trent was already drinking heavily, his hands shaking violently as he poured his third glass of scotch before noon. His pale face was slick with terrified sweat after his disastrous coffee shop encounter. Trent flinched at every loud noise. He kept checking his phone, desperately waiting for an email from his father that never came. Marcus slapped Trent hard on the back, telling him to sober up and smile, because by midnight, their financial problems would completely disappear. They firmly believed they had won. They thought I was currently sitting in some cheap apartment crying over the divorce mediation agreement I had signed the previous afternoon. They thought I had surrendered my entire future out of pure weakness. I was not sitting at home. I was sitting inside a heavily armored black surveillance van parked discreetly in the service alley, directly behind the country club kitchen. The interior of the van was glowing with the blue and green light of a dozen high-definition surveillance monitors. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with me were three elite federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division and the top cybersecurity technicians from my auditing firm. We were not just watching the gala preparations, we had completely hijacked them. My cyber team had easily bypassed the outdated security firewalls of the country club network. We now had absolute total control over the ballroom's entire audiovisual system. Every microphone, every speaker, every massive presentation screen hanging above the grand stage answered directly to the keyboard resting on my lap. The lead federal agent leaned over my shoulder, watching as I seamlessly mapped the fraudulent bank transfers to the presentation software Marcus intended to use. "You are creating a digital kill switch," the agent noted, his voice filled with deep professional respect. "You are going to let him dig his own grave on a live microphone." I nodded, never taking my eyes off the glowing code. "Marcus thinks he is going to project architectural renderings of the Oak Bluffs resort onto those massive screens. But the moment he clicks his presentation remote to ask the billionaires for their $50 million investment, he will trigger a massive automated data dump. The screens will immediately broadcast the irrevocable blind trust documents proving he does not own a single inch of that property. At that exact second, his solicitation of funds becomes an active, undeniable act of federal wire fraud committed in front of 500 witnesses. It was a flawless execution of forensic justice. We successfully linked the federal arrest warrants directly to the digital trigger. The second Marcus asked for the money, the warrants would become active, and the tactical assault teams positioned around the perimeter of the country club would receive their green light to move in. The sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pristine golf course outside. Black luxury vehicles and stretched limousines started pulling into the grand circular driveway. Valets rushed to open doors for city council members and real estate tycoons. The sheer concentration of wealth entering the building was staggering, making the upcoming betrayal even more catastrophic. The radio scanners inside the van began to chatter with updates from the undercover agents blending into the catering staff. "It is time," the lead agent said, adjusting the tactical vest strapped tightly across his chest. "The targets are all on the main floor. The investors are taking their seats." I closed my laptop and stood up in the cramped space of the surveillance van. I reached down and unbuttoned the oversized, muted beige sweater I had deliberately worn to trick Marcus during the mediation the day before. I let the ugly fabric drop to the metal floor. Underneath that pathetic disguise, I was wearing a breathtaking custom-made crimson gown. The silk fabric clung perfectly to my frame, pooling at my feet like liquid fire. It was not a dress meant for a quiet guest. It was the color of absolute authority. It was the color of war. I pulled a tube of bold matte red lipstick from my clutch and applied it using the reflection of the dark monitor screens. I clasped a simple, elegant gold necklace around my throat, a stark contrast to the stolen Cartier diamonds currently resting on my sister's neck. The federal agents watched in stunned silence as the broken, weeping wife they had heard about completely vanished, replaced by an apex predator, ready to burn an entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. I smoothed the heavy silk of my skirt and reached for the heavy metal handle of the van door. I looked back at the lead FBI agent, meeting his gaze with eyes that held zero mercy and absolute determination. "Give me exactly 10 minutes on that microphone before you breach those doors," I told him, my voice ringing with lethal calm. "I am going to make sure they have absolutely nothing left to hide behind." Inside the grand ballroom of the country club, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over tables covered in imported white silk and centerpieces of cascading orchids. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos carried silver trays of vintage champagne, navigating through the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society. This was the exact illusion Vivian had spent her entire life trying to buy her way into. She sat at the center VIP table, radiating a sickening level of pride. Sitting directly to her left was Trent's father, Arthur, a man whose Savannah old money lineage usually kept him far away from events like this. But tonight, the racial and class divides were temporarily suspended by the magnetic pull of Marcus and his promised $50 million real estate venture. Marcus and Tasha were working the room like royalty holding court. Tasha wore a custom silver gown that sparkled under the chandelier light, the stolen Cartier diamond necklace resting heavily on her chest. She laughed a high-pitched artificial sound, tossing her hair as she clinked glasses with the wives of federal judges and commercial real estate tycoons. Marcus stood right beside her, projecting the ultimate image of a brilliant, supportive husband and a visionary financial genius. He clapped state senators on the back, confidently whispering about the massive returns they would see once they bought into the Oak Bluffs resort project. They were completely intoxicated by their own counterfeit success. Trent sat at a nearby table, sweating through his expensive collar, gulping down his fourth scotch, but nobody paid attention to his frantic unraveling. I stood outside the heavy mahogany double doors of the ballroom, listening to the muffled sounds of the string quartet. I took one final deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I gave a sharp nod to the two armed tactical security guards flanking the entrance. They grabbed the brass handles and pulled the massive doors open simultaneously. I stepped into the grand ballroom. The crimson silk of my custom gown caught the chandelier light, burning like a brilliant wildfire against the sea of black tuxedos and muted evening wear. I did not walk tentatively. I moved with the slow, deliberate stride of an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. The effect was instantaneous. The string quartet nearest to the doors faltered, a violinist missing a note as she stared at me. The silence rippled outward, moving across the massive room like a physical shockwave. Conversations abruptly died. Champagne glasses halted halfway to parted lips. 500 of the most powerful people in the state of Georgia turned their heads to look at the woman standing at the top of the grand staircase. Vivian noticed the sudden drop in noise. She turned around in her velvet chair, her annoyed expression instantly morphing into absolute livid panic. The color completely drained from her face. She dropped her crystal flute onto the table, spilling champagne across the white silk tablecloth. She jumped up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. What are you doing here? Vivian hissed aggressively, marching toward the bottom of the staircase, her emerald gown swishing furiously around her ankles. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately trying to gauge how many of her elite friends were watching this disaster unfold. I specifically told you that you were no longer welcome in this family. You are a disgrace. Security. We need security over here right now. She waved her manicured hand frantically toward the perimeter guards. This woman is an uninvited guest. Remove her from the premises immediately before she ruins my daughter's night. I walked down the marble steps, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. I did not break my stride. The country club security guards took one step forward, but immediately froze when they saw the cold, unyielding authority radiating from my posture. They looked at my eyes and instinctively backed away, realizing they were entirely out of their depth. I reached the bottom of the staircase and walked right past my mother. I did not look at her. I did not acknowledge her frantic, hateful whispers. She was nothing more than empty air. Vivian gasped in shock, grabbing at my arm to physically stop me. I smoothly sidestepped her, reaching out to lightly brush her hand away without ever breaking my forward momentum. "Do not touch me, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper that only she could hear. "You are about to need both of your hands to cover your face." I continued my march straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, cutting a path directly toward the main stage. The crowd parted for me, automatically stepping back as if I were carrying a live explosive. I locked eyes with Marcus, who was standing near the front podium. His arrogant smile completely vanished. His jaw tightened, his eyes widening as he recognized the absolute lack of fear in my demeanor. He remembered the blank stare I gave him on the front lawn of our house, and he realized with sudden, paralyzing terror that the game was entirely over. Tasha grabbed Marcus by the arm, her silver gown shaking as she pointed a trembling finger at me. "Get her out of here, Marcus!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a panicked squeal that echoed through the silent room. "She is trying to ruin my award ceremony. Someone call the police right now." I ignored her completely. I reached the front of the room and stepped onto the plush carpeted stairs leading up to the main presentation stage. I looked up toward the darkened audiovisual booth suspended above the balcony. I gave a sharp, deliberate nod to the heavily tinted window. My cybersecurity team, waiting patiently inside the hijacked booth, immediately executed the command. The classical music, cutting through the room, completely cut off, replaced by the sharp, piercing sound of an emergency broadcast tone. The massive floor-to-ceiling presentation screens hanging behind the stage, which were currently displaying Marcus and Tasha's elegant corporate logos, flickered violently. The screens went entirely pitch black for one terrifying second. Then the entire back wall of the ballroom exploded in blinding crimson light. A giant, stark warning flashed across the screens in massive, bold white lettering: "Federal Audit Classified." The collective gasp from the audience was deafening. Trent's father stood up from his VIP table, his face turning a dangerous shade of red as he stared at the federal seal projected onto the screens. Marcus physically stumbled backward, knocking over a microphone stand, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps. Tasha covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting wildly toward the exits. I walked to the center of the stage, the train of my crimson gown sweeping across the dark wood. I reached out and firmly grabbed the main microphone from the center podium. I turned to face the 500 billionaires, politicians, and socialites who were currently staring at me in absolute stunned silence. I gripped the microphone tightly, feeling the cold metal grounding me to the present moment. The time for hiding was officially over. Marcus lunged the second I took possession of the microphone. He charged across the polished wood of the stage, his face contorted in blind panic, sweating heavily through his expensive custom tuxedo. He threw his arms out, desperate to rip the microphone directly from my hands. I did not flinch or retreat. I simply pivoted on my stiletto heels, letting his own reckless momentum carry him right past me. He crashed awkwardly into the heavy wooden podium, stumbling and scrambling to maintain his balance in front of the most powerful people in the state of Georgia. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the cavernous ballroom, sharp, unyielding, and completely devoid of emotion. "Good evening, everyone. My husband was about to stand on this very stage and ask you for $50 million to develop a luxury commercial resort at Oak Bluffs. He prepared beautiful architectural renderings and promised you massive, unprecedented returns on your capital. Before you reach for your checkbooks, let me show you exactly what you are buying. I gave another sharp, deliberate nod toward the tinted glass of the audiovisual booth. The giant screens hanging behind the stage shifted instantly. The glaring red federal warning dissolved, replaced by high-resolution scans of dense, complex legal paperwork. At the very top of the projected documents, the words "Irrevocable Blind Trust Agreement" loomed massively over the silent ballroom. The cyber team zoomed in on the signature page and the beneficiary clause, highlighting the text in bright, undeniable yellow. My name, Jada, was displayed in towering letters as the sole exclusive controlling trustee and the unalterable owner of the entire Oak Bluffs estate. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, keeping my posture entirely rigid. The property Marcus is trying to leverage against your money does not belong to him. I announced my words, striking like physical blows across the hushed room. It does not belong to my mother Vivian, and it does not belong to my father Harold. That land was placed into a secure blind trust exactly 5 years ago. Harold's signature on the deed Marcus is currently carrying in his breast pocket is entirely coerced, forged, and legally worthless. If you invest your funds tonight, you are not building a resort, you are funding a ghost. Marcus finally regained his footing near the podium. His face was a mask of pure terror and rabid desperation. He grabbed a spare wireless microphone from the side of the stage and clicked it on his hands, shaking violently. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Marcus shouted into the mic, his voice cracking with wild panic. "She is my wife and she is suffering from a severe psychotic breakdown. We are currently in the middle of a bitter divorce, and she is just trying to sabotage my business out of pure spite. Those documents are completely fabricated. I have the real deed right here." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out the folded piece of paper he had forced my father to sign on the side of the highway. He waved it frantically in the air like a desperate shield, pleading with the audience to believe his charming facade over the hard digital evidence staring them in the face. But the people sitting in this ballroom did not amass their billions by being stupid. They were apex predators of the financial world, and there was sudden heavy blood in the water. I watched as dozens of venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and hedge fund managers simultaneously pulled out their smartphones. They were not looking at Marcus anymore. They were texting their own corporate legal teams, pulling up state property registries, and aggressively cross-referencing the federal trust identification number clearly displayed on the massive screens behind me. The realization rippled through the room in real time, a wave of collective shock and rising anger. The wealthy elite murmured among themselves, pointing at the screens and shaking their heads in absolute disgust. They recognized an airtight legal document when they saw one. They knew that an irrevocable trust, predating a commercial deed by 5 years, made Marcus's crumpled piece of paper nothing more than expensive kindling. They realized they were seconds away from wiring $50 million into a massive, unrecoverable black hole. Marcus stood on the stage waving his worthless deed, completely abandoned by the room. He looked down at Tasha, who was shrinking back into the shadows of the VIP tables, her hands covering her face in terror. He looked at Vivian, who was staring at the screens in horrified disbelief, finally realizing that the ancestral property she wanted to flaunt was permanently and legally out of her control. But the most dangerous reaction came directly from the center VIP table. Arthur Trent's father, the undisputed patriarch of the old money Savannah Empire, slowly lowered his smartphone. He placed it flat on the white silk tablecloth with deliberate precision. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing against his starched collar. His face had turned a terrifying mottled shade of purple. He did not look at Marcus on the stage, and he did not look at me. Arthur turned his entire body to face his son. Trent was sitting frozen in his velvet chair, a half-empty glass of scotch dangling from his trembling fingers. Trent looked absolutely pathetic, shrinking rapidly under the crushing weight of his father's furious, unblinking glare. Arthur realized his son had recklessly entangled their historic family name with a desperate con artist who had just attempted to defraud the most powerful people in Atlanta on a live microphone. I did not give the room a single second to recover from the shock. The collective gasp from the elite crowd had barely faded into silence before I clicked the presentation remote hidden in my palm. The massive screens hanging above the stage shifted instantly. The blind trust documents vanished. In their place, a web of complex bank statements illuminated the dark ballroom. My cybersecurity team had simplified the forensic data so that even a layman could understand it, but for the financial titans sitting in the audience, it was a perfectly painted map of absolute financial ruin. I directed my gaze toward the center VIP table, looking right at Trent's father. The patriarch of Savannah's oldest money was already on his feet, his chest heaving, his face a mask of purple fury. Look closely at the top left corner of the screen, I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy tension. That is the highly guarded routing number for the primary ancestral trust of your family. A trust that has survived and grown for over a century. Now watch exactly where that money goes. Bright red arrows animated across the massive screens. They traced a relentless bleeding flow of capital. $3 million here, $5 million there. The arrows shot directly from the allegedly secure family accounts and landed squarely into a commercial checking account. The name attached to that account flashed in giant, undeniable letters. It was the corporate entity registered to Tasha's luxury lifestyle brand. The wealthy crowd began to murmur loudly, their shock turning into vocal outrage. Tasha shrank further back against the heavy velvet drapery, her hands trembling so violently that the champagne spilled from her glass, staining her designer silver gown. I continued my narration, relentless and clinical. Trent authorized my husband Marcus to act as a shadow financial manager. Marcus immediately drained the generational wealth and funneled every single dime through a sham storefront selling organic candles and silk robes. But the money did not stay there. Another set of red arrows pulsed on the screen, shooting from Tasha's boutique accounts and disappearing into a list of untraceable offshore shell corporations. And just like that, I said, lowering the microphone slightly so the absolute finality of my words could sink in, the historic fortune was washed clean and sent overseas. Trent allowed a desperate con artist to use his wife's bankrupt boutique as a laundromat for stolen money. Trent's father exploded. The polite, restrained veneer of upper-class society shattered completely. He slammed his fist down on the VIP table with enough force to crack the crystal centerpieces. "You let a con man steal our family's legacy for a boutique," he screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice cracked with sheer devastating rage, echoing across the silent ballroom. "You absolute failure. You gave away everything your grandfather built to float a cheap suburban storefront." Trent jumped out of his velvet chair, sweat pouring down his pale face. His white privilege, the shield he had used to confidently intimidate me at the coffee shop, offered him absolutely zero protection against his father's wrath. "Dad, please listen to me," Trent begged, holding his hands up defensively, his voice shaking. It was a bridge loan. Marcus swore he could double the capital using the Oak Bluffs development. He lied to me. He told me the property was clear and ready to build. Marcus is the one who set the whole thing up. Marcus, standing near the edge of the stage with his worthless forged deed still crumpled in his hand, realized Trent was throwing him directly to the wolves. The arrogant facade Marcus wore so easily finally broke. He leaped off the short stage and charged toward the VIP table, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. "You weak, pathetic coward," Marcus roared, shoving a terrified waiter out of his way. "You begged me to save your failing firm. You were drowning in bad debt long before you gave me access to those accounts. You knew exactly what we were doing." Trent lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the lapels of his custom tuxedo. "You ruined my life," Trent screamed, spitting the words into Marcus's face. Marcus retaliated instantly, driving his fist hard into Trent's chest and shoving him backward. Trent crashed into a towering table of hors d'oeuvres, sending silver platters of caviar and smoked salmon flying across the room. The two men, previously the polished, shining stars of Atlanta's high society, began physically grappling and shoving each other like common street brawlers, right in the middle of the grand ballroom. Marcus threw a blind punch that grazed Trent's jaw, while Trent grabbed Marcus by the collar, ripping his expensive silk bow tie straight off his neck. The wealthy elite scrambled out of the way, horrified and captivated by the chaotic violence. Security guards rushed forward, struggling to pull the two grown men apart as they cursed and swung wildly at each other. Through the madness, Vivian stood frozen at her table, realizing her entire social kingdom was burning to ash. The country club matriarchs, she had spent decades trying to impress, were currently whispering and pointing, watching her son-in-law and her daughter's husband fistfight over federal fraud. The prestigious image she had sacrificed everything to build was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. Desperate to salvage any remaining shred of her dignity, Vivian rushed toward the edge of the stage. She grabbed a spare microphone from a discarded stand. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, her emerald gown stained with spilled wine from the ensuing chaos. "This is just a business dispute," Vivian yelled into the microphone, her voice high-pitched and shrill, echoing awkwardly over the sounds of the physical struggle on the floor. My daughter Tasha had absolutely no idea what these men were doing behind closed doors. She is an innocent victim of their financial manipulation. Tasha is completely innocent. I turned slowly to look at my mother. The desperation in her eyes was pathetic. She was still trying to protect her golden child, even as the walls of a federal prison closed in around them all. She was willing to ignore the staggering evidence projected right behind me, just to maintain her hollow social status. I raised my own microphone to my lips. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a cold, terrifying clarity that instantly silenced the entire room once again. "Innocent," I said, smiling a cold, razor-sharp smile that made the blood drain entirely from Vivian's face. "Let us talk about innocence, mother." I did not wait for my mother to formulate another desperate defense. I raised my left hand and gave a sharp signal to the audiovisual booth hovering above the balcony. I pressed the central button on my presentation remote. The massive screens behind me instantly faded to a solid, imposing black, but the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers flanking the grand ballroom crackled to life. The audio was pristine and undeniable. It was the exact high-definition recording I had captured while hiding in the darkness of my father's cedar closet. The crystal-clear sound of heavy breathing, rustling clothing, and wet, passionate kissing echoed across the silent ballroom. It was loud and obscenely intimate. The wealthy socialites standing near the stage physically recoiled. Wives of federal judges and powerful politicians covered their mouths in absolute shock. Right on the heels of the explicit kissing, Marcus's voice boomed through the speakers. His tone was dripping with arrogance and cruel satisfaction. "As soon as Harold takes the fall for the embezzlement, I will file the divorce papers. Jada will be out on the street with absolutely nothing. We will strip her and that weak old man down to the bone." Tasha's unmistakable voice followed immediately after his, accompanied by a dark, vicious laugh. "Just make sure you completely drain his corporate accounts before the feds raid his office, Marcus. I want every single dollar washed through the boutique by Friday." The entire ballroom erupted into a frenzy of scandalized gasps and furious whispers. The elite crowd stared at Tasha with unshielded disgust. She was no longer the brilliant entrepreneur of the year. She was an adulterous thief who had actively conspired to send her own father to a federal penitentiary. Trent's father, Arthur, stood rigidly at the VIP table looking at his son with an expression of pure murderous contempt. Trent had not only bankrupted his family, but he had allowed his wife to publicly humiliate their old money name in front of the entire city. The sheer humiliation of being the ultimate cuckold in high society was a fatal blow to Trent's ego. Tasha stumbled backward against the stage, her hands trembling violently as she tried to cover her ears. "Turn it off," she screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "It is fake. She fabricated it. Jada is using artificial intelligence to frame us. Somebody turn off the speakers right now." Nobody moved. Not a single security guard stepped forward. The audio quality left absolutely zero room for denial. The malice and greed in the recording matched Tasha's real personality entirely too well. The crowd knew exactly what they were hearing. They were listening to a criminal conspiracy unfolding in real time. But I was not finished. I let the recording continue to play, delivering the absolute killing blow. Through the massive speakers, Marcus's recorded voice asked a fatal question. "What about your mother?" Vivian is going to start asking serious questions when her country club dues bounce, and her credit cards get declined. The ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the golden child to defend the mother who had just sacrificed her entire reputation to protect her. Tasha's recorded voice echoed through the high ceilings, clear and brutally callous. "Once we get the money, we will throw my mother in that cheap state nursing home down in Macon. She is a vain, manipulable old fool who only cares about country club gossip and expensive dresses. She will not even notice the money is gone until she is locked in a ward smelling like bleach and cheap soup. I am entirely done dealing with her pathetic need for attention." The silence that slammed into the ballroom was suffocating. It was a heavy, devastating quiet that felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. 500 members of Atlanta's most exclusive upper-class society slowly turned their heads, simultaneously looking directly at Vivian. Vivian stood frozen near the edge of the stage. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy, elite family completely evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but ugly, toxic ruins. The high society women she had spent decades kissing up to, the women she had bragged to just an hour ago, were now looking at her with a mixture of profound pity and absolute revulsion. She had dedicated her entire existence to chasing status, actively abusing and discarding me to elevate Tasha. And her precious golden child had just declared to the entire world that Vivian was nothing but a vain, manipulable old fool fit for a budget state facility. Vivian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her chest heaved irregularly as she struggled to pull air into her collapsing lungs. The physical shock of the ultimate betrayal hit her with the force of a freight train. Her perfectly manicured fingers went entirely slack. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from her hand. It hit the polished marble floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed violently through the silent room. Vivian did not look at the shattered glass. She did not look at the elite friends who were currently backing away from her, as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. She turned her head slowly, her neck moving with mechanical stiffness, until her eyes locked directly onto Tasha. Tasha was backed into a corner, her designer silver gown ruined by spilled drinks and her own terrified sweat. The stolen Cartier diamond necklace felt like a heavy chain around her throat. She looked at her mother and saw a level of sheer absolute devastation that transcended mere anger. Tasha's face froze in absolute terror, realizing that the one person on earth who had always blindly protected her, the woman who had happily destroyed her other daughter to clear Tasha's path, had just become her most dangerous enemy. Vivian stood absolutely rigid. The pristine image she had ruthlessly cultivated for 40 years was lying in shards at her feet, right next to her broken champagne flute. She looked at the faces of the women in the front row. These were the power brokers of Atlanta high society. The country club presidents, the charity board directors, the wives of federal judges. For decades, Vivian had bent over backward to sit at their tables. She had eagerly thrown my practical career and my happiness directly into the fire just to keep Tasha shining brightly enough to impress these exact people. Now those same women were looking at Vivian not with envy or respect, but with pure, unadulterated revulsion. They were holding up their smartphones, recording her absolute ruin in high definition. Tasha raised her hands defensively. Her voice shook as she tried to backpedal frantically. "Mom, please," she stammered, taking a step backward, her silver designer gown catching the light. "Marcus made me say that. It was just a stupid joke. You know I would never put you in a state facility. I love you, Mom." The lie was so transparent it was insulting. Vivian did not respond with words. The overwhelming magnitude of the betrayal completely bypassed her ability to reason. A guttural, visceral scream ripped out of Vivian's throat. It was a raw, animalistic sound of pure agony and blinding rage. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had sold her soul to build a pedestal for a daughter who was actively measuring her for a coffin. Vivian lunged forward with terrifying speed. She closed the distance between them before Tasha could even turn to run. Vivian reached out with both hands and grabbed 2 fistfuls of Tasha's perfectly blown-out hair. She yanked her golden child forward with vicious, brutal force. Tasha let out a piercing shriek as Vivian raised her right hand and delivered a devastating open-palmed slap directly across Tasha's face. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot over the gasps of the wealthy crowd. "You ungrateful little parasite!" Vivian roared, her voice completely unrecognizable. "I gave you everything. I bought your clothes. I funded your pathetic lifestyle. I threw your own sister out of my house to protect your fraudulent marriage. And you were going to lock me in a ward smelling of bleach while you stole my money." Vivian slapped her again, her heavy diamond rings tearing a bright red scratch across Tasha's cheek. Tasha screamed in pain and panic. Her own survival instincts kicked in, overriding any lingering respect for her mother. Tasha reached out her perfectly manicured nails, curling like claws, and grabbed the neckline of Vivian's custom emerald silk gown. She yanked hard. The expensive fabric gave way with a loud, sickening rip, exposing Vivian's shoulder and tearing the delicate construction of the bodice completely in half. "You are a vain, stupid old woman!" Tasha shrieked back, spitting the words directly into her mother's face. "You only cared about using me to show off to your rich friends. You never loved me. You just loved the attention." The two women completely abandoned any remaining shred of human dignity. They grappled wildly in the center of the grand ballroom, swinging their arms and clawing at each other's faces. The elite crowd scrambled backward, horrified by the raw violence unfolding in the middle of their prestigious gala. Trent's father, Arthur, stood frozen at his VIP table, shielding his wife from the chaotic spectacle, muttering in absolute disgust about the trash they had let into their family. Vivian shoved Tasha hard against the chest. Tasha stumbled, her high stiletto heels slipping violently on the polished marble floor. She grabbed Vivian's arm to catch her balance, but only succeeded in dragging her mother down with her. The two women crashed backward directly into a massive multi-tiered catering table. It was an explosion of culinary destruction. Crystal platters of imported caviar, silver trays of smoked salmon, and towering arrangements of fresh oysters shattered onto the floor. A massive swan carved entirely from solid ice toppled over and smashed into heavy wet chunks around them. Vivian and Tasha rolled violently through the wreckage of the hors d'oeuvres. The pristine emerald silk and the sparkling silver gown were instantly soaked in cocktail sauce, melted ice, and crushed food. They thrashed on the ground covered in garbage, screaming vicious, hateful insults at each other. Vivian yanked the stolen Cartier diamond necklace right off Tasha's neck, the heavy chain snapping and sending diamonds scattering across the slick marble. Tasha kicked wildly, her heel catching Vivian in the shin. They were completely covered in food and disgrace, behaving like feral animals in front of 500 live streaming cameras. The socialites who had previously worshipped them were now laughing in shock, documenting the ultimate destruction of the city's most arrogant family. I stood motionless on the main stage, looking down at the pathetic scene unfolding below me. I did not step forward to intervene. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. My custom crimson gown remained entirely immaculate. I held the microphone loosely in my right hand, watching the woman who had abused me for decades and the sister who had tried to steal my future physically tear each other to shreds in a puddle of shrimp cocktail. The empire they had built on lies and stolen money was completely eradicated. Their social standing in Atlanta was permanently, fatally destroyed. They would never be allowed to step foot in a country club, a charity gala, or a high society dinner ever again. Marcus watched the brawl from the edge of the stage, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. He looked around the ballroom, frantically searching for a way out. The private security guards hired by the country club were too busy trying to pull Vivian and Tasha apart to notice him edging toward the kitchen exit. But Marcus would never make it to the door. Over the screams of the brawling women and the shocked murmurs of the wealthy crowd, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the ballroom. It was the sharp, wailing shriek of multiple police sirens rapidly approaching the building. The flashing glare of brilliant red and blue emergency lights sliced through the darkness outside, illuminating the towering stained glass windows of the country club with a strobe effect of impending justice. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom did not just open. They were violently kicked apart. The heavy wood slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crash. Dozens of federal agents dressed in full tactical gear and dark windbreakers swarmed into the elegant room. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, fanning out across the perimeter and blocking every single exit. Their heavy combat boots trampled over the scattered orchids and spilled champagne. "Nobody move!" A commanding voice boomed over a heavy bullhorn, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Federal agents, we are executing multiple felony arrest warrants. Stay exactly where you are." The deafening echo of the bullhorn shattered whatever fragile remnants of denial Marcus was still clinging to. He stood paralyzed near the edge of the stage, his eyes darting frantically across the perimeter of the grand ballroom. Federal agents were systematically locking down every single point of egress. The glittering high society event had instantly transformed into a high-security federal trap. Marcus looked down at his own shaking hands, and then looked across the ruined floor at Tasha. His supposed partner in crime was currently weeping in a puddle of crushed ice and cocktail sauce, clutching her torn silver dress as agents began moving in her direction. In that split second, Marcus did exactly what cowards always do when their backs are pushed against the wall. He abandoned the woman he claimed to love and ran to save his own skin. He spun on his heel and sprinted toward the back of the venue. He knew the layout of the country club from attending dozens of Vivian's pretentious charity galas over the years. The only viable escape route was through the service corridors leading out to the loading docks. He tore through the panicked crowd of billionaires and socialites, shoving them aside with brutal, desperate force. Wives of state senators screamed as Marcus barreled past them, his custom tuxedo jacket flapping wildly. A young waiter balancing a towering tray of crystal water glasses stepped into the aisle. Marcus did not even try to avoid him. He violently shoved the young man directly in the chest, sending him crashing into a pillar as a storm of shattered glass rained down on the intricately patterned carpet. The sound of breaking crystal barely registered over the roaring blood rushing in Marcus's ears. He did not look back. He kept his eyes locked on the heavy, swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, convinced that the dark service alley on the other side was his golden ticket to freedom. He believed his own lies right up until the very last second. He hit the swinging doors with his shoulder bursting into the brightly lit stainless steel culinary prep area, with his lungs burning for oxygen. But Marcus did not find an empty kitchen or an unguarded alleyway. He slammed directly into an impenetrable wall of solid black Kevlar. A specialized unit of federal tactical agents had already secured the loading docks and locked down the service corridors. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the kitchen, their hands resting comfortably on their tactical belts. Marcus rebounded off the chest of the largest agent, stumbling backward into a towering metal rack of baking sheets. The deafening clatter of falling metal trays filled the room. He gasped for air, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror as the agents immediately closed the circle around him. The cold reality of his situation crashed down on him. There was nowhere left to run. There were no more wealthy investors to charm, no more accounts to drain, and no more lies to spin. Then the sea of dark windbreakers parted perfectly down the middle. Stepping forward from the safety of the federal perimeter was my father. Harold did not look like the broken, weeping man Marcus had shoved against a mahogany desk just 24 hours earlier. He did not look like a frail victim surrendering his family legacy under the threat of blackmail. Standing in the harsh kitchen light, my father looked taller, his shoulders pulled back with an imposing, unyielding strength that demanded absolute respect. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, looking down at the man who had slept in his house, eaten at his dinner table, and plotted to send him to a federal penitentiary. Marcus opened his mouth, stammering desperately, trying to form a coherent lie, trying to blame Trent, trying to bargain his way out of the inevitable. My father did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to establish his dominance over a man who had tried to steal his entire life. He spoke with the quiet, devastating authority of a patriarch reclaiming his stolen throne. "You forgot who built this family, Marcus. I survived decades of corporate warfare to build that estate. You thought a cheap suit and a forged signature could erase my bloodline." Before Marcus could utter another pathetic excuse, the lead agent gave a sharp nod. Two massive officers lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by both arms. They spun him around with ruthless efficiency and slammed him face first onto the cold stainless steel surface of a massive culinary prep table. Marcus shrieked in pain as his cheek smashed against the hard metal. His custom tuxedo ripped at the seams as the agents wrenched his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp, mistakable clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, echoed through the kitchen. The golden boy of Atlanta finance was currently pinned to a cutting board, weeping uncontrollably, begging the officers for a deal he would never receive. Back in the grand ballroom, the scene was equally catastrophic. Trent was completely broken. The arrogant old money savior who had laughed in my face and thrown $100,000 check at me was currently on his knees on the marble floor. He was weeping hysterically, grabbing fistfuls of his father's expensive suit jacket. Trent begged his father to call the family lawyers, pleading with him to use their historic Savannah connections to make the federal agents go away. He cried that he was set up, that Marcus had manipulated him, that he was a victim of a sophisticated scam. Arthur looked down at his sobbing son with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The racial and class superiority that the family had wielded for generations offered absolutely zero protection against a federal racketeering and wire fraud charge broadcast live to the entire city. The elite attendees, the politicians, and the judges were already texting their own wealth managers, distancing themselves from Trent's ruined family name. Arthur realized that Trent had not only bankrupted their ancestral trust, but had permanently disgraced their untouchable lineage for the sake of a fraudulent luxury boutique and a desperate con artist. Arthur reached down and violently peeled Trent's sweating fingers off his tailored jacket. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He did not promise legal protection. Arthur simply turned his back on his weeping son, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back a single time. Federal agents moved in instantly. They hauled Trent up by his armpits, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists while he hyperventilated in sheer panic. Across the room, two female agents pulled Tasha from the wreckage of the catering table. Tasha shrieked wildly, kicking her ruined designer heels against the marble floor, her ruined silver gown dripping with cocktail sauce and melted ice. The cold steel cuffs snapped tightly around her wrists, biting into the skin, right where her stolen diamond bracelets used to rest. Vivian remained frozen on the floor, watching her golden child being hauled away like a common criminal. Vivian did not reach out to help her daughter. She just stared at the handcuffs, her own vanity completely shattered by the realization that her social reign was permanently over. The lead agent stepped to the center of the ballroom, holding a printed warrant, and began reading them their Miranda rights. The loud, authoritative recitation of their right to remain silent bounced off the crystal chandeliers, permanently sealing their destruction in front of every single elite socialite who had once worshipped them. I stood alone at the center of the main stage, looking down at the total systematic eradication of their corrupt empire. My custom crimson gown remained absolutely flawless, untouched by the chaos, the flying glass, or the desperate scrambling of the guilty. I did not smile, and I did not gloat. I watched the agents march my cheating husband, my treacherous sister, and her arrogant husband out of the ballroom in chains, perfectly composed and entirely victorious. The chaotic aftermath of the Atlanta Heritage Gala dominated the national news cycle for 72 straight hours. The spectacular downfall of my family became a cautionary tale among the wealthy elite. While the city feasted on scandalous headlines, I remained focused on the final phase of my operation. 3 days after the raid, I walked into the high-security federal holding facility in downtown Atlanta. My gold federal auditor badge bypassed standard visitation protocols entirely. Heavy steel doors echoed with a metallic clang as armed guards escorted me down the sterile corridors. They led me into a stark, windowless interrogation room, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. A solid steel table was bolted directly to the center of the gray floor. I took a seat in the hard plastic chair, placing a single manila folder on the table. A minute later, the heavy door swung open. Two heavily armed correctional officers escorted my husband inside. Marcus looked absolutely unrecognizable. The charismatic financial executive who effortlessly worked country club ballrooms was completely gone. He wore an oversized bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his shoulders. His designer haircut was a disheveled mess. Dark bags circled his bloodshot eyes, and a purple bruise colored his cheekbone where he slammed into the prep table during his arrest. He looked small and entirely stripped of his arrogant power. Officers forced him into the chair across from me, securing his wrist chains to a metal ring welded to the table. They stepped outside, leaving us alone. Marcus stared at me, his hands shaking violently against the steel restraints. The moment the door clicked shut, his fragile composure shattered. He leaned forward as far as the chains would allow, tears instantly flooding his bloodshot eyes. "Jada, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking with raw panic. "You have to help me. Talk to the federal prosecutors. Tell them I was manipulated. Tell them Trent forced me to move the money to save his firm." Tasha handled the offshore routing numbers. "They used me, Jada. I was just trying to secure our future. I am your husband. You have to get me a plea deal." I sat perfectly still, watching the pathetic display of cowardice unfolding. He was willing to throw the woman he had been sleeping with directly under the bus to save his own skin. He had zero loyalty to anyone but himself. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt nothing but clinical satisfaction observing his total collapse. He was finally experiencing the sheer terror he had callously planned for my father. "I am not here to negotiate a plea deal, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing coldly off the concrete walls. "I am here to finalize our legal paperwork right now." I reached out and opened the manila folder. I pulled out a crisp, clean document, sliding it slowly across the steel table, stopping it right in front of his chained hands. Marcus blinked rapidly, his tears falling onto the metallic surface as he struggled to focus on the paper. It was the legally binding divorce mediation agreement he had arrogantly forced me to sign 24 hours before the gala. "Do you remember this document, Marcus?" I asked, leaning forward. "You were so incredibly proud of yourself in that mediation room. You thought you were bullying a broken, weeping woman into surrendering everything. You demanded full legal control over our upcoming real estate ventures, specifically naming the Oak Bluffs Commercial Resort project. You insisted on taking total ownership of that corporate entity and all the financial liabilities attached to it. In exchange, you graciously agreed to waive your right to raid my personal retirement accounts. You thought you won the entire board." Marcus stared at his own signature at the bottom of the page, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. He was beginning to realize the catastrophic magnitude of the legal trap closing around him, every single word suddenly choking him tight. "You firmly believed you were locking down a $50 million ancestral property." I continued, my tone devoid of any mercy. "You thought you had outsmarted me and my father. But Harold's signature on your deed was always a legally worthless forgery. You never owned Oak Bluffs. Because you aggressively demanded total ownership of that commercial entity in our divorce settlement, you legally claimed 100% of the fraudulent debt associated with it. You formally absolved me of any financial connection to your crimes on the public record." Marcus let out a choked, agonizing gasp. His chest heaved as the paralyzing reality of his situation crushed the remaining air from his lungs. "You owe the federal government and Trent's investors over $30 million in restitution," I stated, delivering the fatal blow with surgical precision. "Because you signed this mediation agreement claiming all the corporate liabilities, you cannot touch a single dime of my clean, protected assets to pay for your legal defense. You have zero capital. You have zero leverage. The public defender's office will let the federal prosecutors completely bury you." Marcus collapsed forward, burying his face against his chained hands. He wept loudly, his shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. He had orchestrated an elaborate, vicious scheme to leave me destitute and homeless, but his own suffocating greed ultimately engineered his absolute ruin. He locked himself in a cage from the inside and handed me the only key. I stood up from the hard plastic chair and buttoned my tailored blazer. I looked down at the weeping, broken man who had betrayed my family and tried to steal my future. "You didn't just lose Marcus," I whispered smoothly. "You dug your own grave, bought the headstone, and handed me the shovel." I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy steel door. I knocked twice, signaling the guards to open it. I stepped out into the bright, sterile corridor without a single backward glance, leaving him weeping in the interrogation room, broken. I stepped out of the federal holding facility and into the bright Atlanta sunlight, breathing in the crisp morning air. The heavy stench of desperation Marcus exuded was completely washed away by the time my private driver pulled up to my new residence. I had officially moved out of the luxury hotel and purchased a breathtaking multi-million-dollar penthouse in the heart of Midtown. The expansive dual-level suite featured floor-to-ceiling windows, wrapping around the entire living space, offering a panoramic, unhindered view of the city I had just conquered. The pristine white marble floors gleamed under custom modern chandeliers. For the first time in my entire life, my home was a true sanctuary, completely free of toxic expectations and gaslighting. My father was safely established in the guest wing, enjoying the quiet peace he had been denied for 40 years. I was standing at my massive quartz kitchen island, reviewing the final asset transfer documents for the Oak Bluffs estate, when the private security intercom buzzed sharply. The concierge spoke through the speaker, his voice laced with professional hesitation. He informed me that a woman claiming to be my mother was standing in the lobby. She was reportedly causing a major scene, demanding to be led upstairs immediately. I did not panic, and I did not feel a single ounce of obligation. I simply told security to send her up to my private foyer and wait right outside the elevator doors. I wanted to see the aftermath of the explosion I had triggered at the gala. When the private elevator chimed and the heavy steel doors slid open, Vivian stepped out into my pristine foyer. I barely recognized the woman standing in front of me. The imposing, terrifying matriarch, who had ruled Atlanta high society with an iron fist, was completely gone. Vivian looked small, frail, and entirely broken. She was wearing a wrinkled beige trench coat that hung awkwardly on her frame, a stark contrast to the custom emerald gowns she usually flaunted. Her hair was unkempt, her roots showing gray, and her face was entirely devoid of the expensive makeup she used to wear like impenetrable armor. She looked around the sheer opulence of my penthouse, her eyes widening as she took in the staggering display of my independent wealth. Then she looked at me and immediately burst into heavy theatrical tears. "Jada, my baby," Vivian sobbed, stepping forward with her arms outstretched. "Thank God you are here. You are the only one I have left." I did not step forward to meet her embrace. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly inside the pockets of my tailored wide-leg trousers. I looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor examining a bankrupt account. "Stop right there, Vivian," I commanded, my voice echoing sharply off the marble floors. "Do not take another step into my home." Vivian froze, her arms dropping to her sides. She let out a loud, pathetic wail, burying her face in her hands. The performance was nauseating. She launched into a frantic, breathless monologue playing the ultimate victim. She told me that her entire life had been destroyed overnight. The exclusive country club had permanently revoked her membership the morning after the gala and publicly banned her from the premises. Her wealthy socialite friends, the women she had prioritized over her own flesh and blood, had completely blocked her phone number and refused to be associated with a massive federal scandal. But the most devastating blow had come directly from her precious golden child. "Tasha took everything." Vivian wept, her voice cracking with raw, genuine panic. "Before the federal agents froze her accounts, Tasha wired every single dollar out of my personal savings to pay for her own criminal defense retainers. She forged my signature on a massive line of credit and completely drained my retirement fund. The bank is foreclosing on my estate, Jada. I am entirely bankrupt. I have absolutely nowhere to go. You have to take care of your mother. Blood is thicker than water." The sheer audacity of her demands was breathtaking. After decades of emotional abuse, after standing on my front lawn and watching Marcus throw my belongings into garbage bags, after actively cheering for my total destruction, she actually believed she could invoke the concept of family loyalty. "You want to talk about blood, Vivian?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously low and perfectly steady register. "Where was this maternal devotion when you slapped me across the face at your Sunday dinner table? Where was your protective instinct when Tasha threatened to have me committed to a psychiatric ward so she could steal my inheritance? You knew exactly what Marcus and Trent were doing. You knew they were actively framing my father to rot in a federal prison, and you looked the other way because Trent's old money pedigree made you feel important." Vivian shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "I did not know, Jada. I swear I did not know how bad it was. They manipulated me just like they manipulated you. We are both victims here. We have to stick together now." I let out a short, hollow laugh that held absolutely zero humor. Do not ever put us in the same category, I told her, taking one deliberate step forward. I am not a victim. I am the woman who dismantled their entire criminal empire while you were busy bragging about a sham boutique. You are only standing in my foyer right now because the daughter you actually wanted threw you directly under the bus to save herself. Jada, please, Vivian begged, falling to her knees on the cold marble floor. Her voice echoed with complete and utter desperation. You cannot turn me away. I gave you life. I raised you. I am your mother. You owe me. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman, kneeling in my beautiful new home. I felt no anger. I felt no grief. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. The invisible chains of childhood guilt and familial obligation completely dissolved into thin air. You chose your golden child, Vivian. I said, my words slicing through the air with devastating calm. You let her try to destroy me, and you cheered her on while she did it. You sat back and smiled while they planned my ruin, because you thought it would buy you a permanent seat at the country club. You made your bed and now you get to lie in it alone. Vivian looked up at me, her eyes wide with total disbelief. She opened her mouth to scream another plea, but I did not give her the chance. I raised my hand and signaled the two massive private security guards waiting just outside the elevator doors. You have no daughter here, I said, turning my back to her completely. Remove this woman from my property and ensure she is never allowed back into this building. The security guards stepped forward immediately, grabbing Vivian firmly by the arms and lifting her off the marble floor. She shrieked, kicking and thrashing as they dragged her backward toward the elevator. She screamed my name, begging, cursing, and sobbing wildly, but I did not turn around. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the bright, beautiful Atlanta skyline. The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid shut, cutting off her frantic screams entirely. The absolute silence that fell over my penthouse was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The absolute silence of my penthouse was only the prelude to the sweeping justice that followed over the next 8 months. The federal trial was swift, brutal, and highly publicized. I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse every single day, wearing immaculately tailored suits, watching the complete systemic destruction of the people who had tried to bury my father and me. Marcus and Trent sat at the defense table looking like hollow, terrified shells of the arrogant men they used to be. The prosecution presented the mountain of forensic financial evidence I had meticulously compiled. The digital paper trail was so undeniable and absolute that the jury did not even need a full day to deliberate. The judge handed down the sentences with zero leniency. Marcus and Trent each received 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. They were found guilty of wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. As the heavy wooden gavel fell, Trent turned desperately toward the gallery looking for his father. But Arthur was not there. Trent's old Savannah family had completely and legally disowned him. They refused to pay for his defense attorneys, refused to attend the trial, and permanently struck his name from their ancestral registry. Trent was dragged out of the courtroom weeping, completely abandoned by the white privilege he thought made him invincible. Tasha fared no better. The former golden child stood before the federal judge trembling in a cheap, ill-fitting beige pantsuit, a stark contrast to the stolen Cartier diamonds she used to flaunt at country club galas. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging for mercy, claiming she was just a naive wife following her husband's orders. She even tried to blame Vivian, screaming that her mother had pressured her into maintaining a wealthy lifestyle at any cost. The judge silenced her by reading her own vicious text messages aloud for the public record. Tasha was sentenced to 10 solid years in a federal women's penitentiary. Furthermore, the court ordered her to pay over $4 million in criminal restitution. Every single designer bag, luxury vehicle, and piece of jewelry she owned was seized and auctioned off by the federal government. She was stripped down to absolutely nothing. With the corporate criminals securely locked in federal cages, and Vivian permanently banished to the ruins of her own vanity, the toxic fog that had suffocated our family for decades finally lifted. Spring arrived and my father and I left the oppressive heat of Atlanta behind. We boarded a private flight and traveled to the one place that represented our true, untainted legacy. I stood beside my father on the expansive wrap around porch of our historic Oak Bluffs estate in Martha's Vineyard. The salty breeze coming off the Atlantic Ocean carried the fresh scent of pine and crisp ocean water. I had not turned the property into the commercialized soulless mega resort Marcus had pitched to the billionaires. Instead, utilizing my own clean capital, I had meticulously restored the sprawling Victorian home to its original breathtaking glory. I legally registered the property as a protected historical landmark. It would forever remain a private sanctuary honoring the resilience of Black generational wealth. It was safe from greedy developers, safe from vanity, and safe from anyone who did not respect the blood and sweat it took to build it. I looked over at my father. Harold was sitting in a handcrafted wooden rocking chair, wearing a comfortable linen shirt and reading a novel. The deep worry lines that used to crease his forehead were entirely gone. He looked 10 years younger. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely free of Vivian's relentless toxic demands and the crushing pressure of her social climbing. He was at peace, surrounded by the history his own grandfather had built, knowing his legacy was absolutely secure in my hands. He looked up from his book, met my gaze, and offered a warm, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. I smiled back, taking a slow sip from a crystal glass of exceptionally rare, full-bodied red wine. The taste was rich, complex, and deeply satisfying. As I turned my attention back to the stunning orange and purple hues of the sunset painting the horizon, the sudden sharp vibration of my cell phone broke the tranquil silence of the porch. I pulled the phone from the pocket of my silk trousers. The caller identification screen displayed an unknown out-of-state number. I swiped to accept the call, bringing the device to my ear without saying a word. A cold, automated robotic voice immediately filled the line. You have a prepaid collect call from an inmate at the United States Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta. Press 1 to accept the charges. I pressed 1, my face remaining perfectly calm. There was a brief burst of static followed by the frantic, desperate sound of heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Jada, a voice pleaded, cracking with raw, pathetic panic. Jada, please do not hang up. You have to talk to me. It is Marcus. It is horrible in here. You have to call the lawyers. You have to tell the judge you made a mistake with the audit. Please, baby, I am begging you. I have absolutely nobody else. My cellmate keeps threatening me. They took everything from me. I am so sorry. Just please help me get out of here. I held the phone slightly away from my ear, stepping up to the polished wooden railing of the balcony. I looked out over the vast, endless expanse of the dark blue ocean, listening to the rhythmic, soothing crash of the waves against the shoreline. Marcus was crying now, his arrogant, manipulative charm completely replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a broken man locked in a concrete cage. He was begging the woman he had tried to destroy to throw him a lifeline. I brought the phone back to my lips. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with the effortless, devastating grace of a woman who had already won the entire war. Enjoy the concrete, Marcus, I whispered smoothly into the receiver. I hit the end call button, cutting off his frantic sobbing mid-sentence. I looked down at the glowing screen of my phone. With one deliberate, deeply satisfying tap of my thumb, I selected his number and pressed block. The contact vanished into the digital void, permanently erased from my existence. I powered the phone completely off and slipped it back into my pocket. I leaned against the balcony railing, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my expensive red wine. The ocean breeze washed over my face, carrying the scent of salt and total freedom. I closed my eyes and breathed in the sweet, quiet air of absolute, undeniable victory. The greatest lesson from Jada is that blood does not demand blind loyalty. Toxic family members will drain your peace, drain your finances, and drain your spirit if you let them. True power comes from absolute financial independence and the quiet courage to walk away from people who only value you as a scapegoat. Protect your peace at all costs, build your own legacy, and never apologize for surviving their worst betrayals. Share this video if you choose yourself today.